I tried to eat as many oysters as I possibly can, and here's how it turned out.
Never again.
The most oysters I ever ate was actually at an all you can eat oyster brunch right here in St. Mary's County, and I decided I wanted to see if I could beat that record. Now, you probably think because I eat so many oysters, I've eaten oysters my whole life, and that can't be further from the truth. I ate my first raw oyster when I was in college, which was honestly about 20 years ago, but when I was a kid, I never ate oysters. But when I was a kid, I was always around the water. I grew up in a community that had a pier and a boat ramp, and so I had my little rowboat and I would go out there and crab and fish. So I've always loved seafood, and that carried throughout my life. When I got into college, I still did lots of crabbing and fishing, but I started oystering as well. Oyster tongs are basically like a basket with teeth on the end of like a 16-foot pair of tongs. They're really heavy, and the times that you can go oystering is obviously in the winter because the cooler weather months are better for eating raw oysters because there's less likelihood that you can get diseases like Vibrio in the water. Because the less warm the water is, or the colder the water is, the less chance Vibrio has to grow. And I think a lot of science has pointed to the fact that under 60 degrees of water temperature means there's a very little chance of Vibrio. And so eating oysters during these cold weather months can really reduce the risk of getting some sort of foodborne illness from the raw oyster itself. Now, you can always go the route of just like cooking the oyster. You don't have to eat it raw, but I really do enjoy raw oyster. Now, back to my story. I would tong up a fair amount of oysters and I did enjoy eating them, but I always felt they were really, really dirty. And the variance in size kind of was a pain in the butt too, because sometimes those oysters would be way too big to eat raw. I was talking about this with someone and they told me about farm raised oysters. So, farm raised oysters are oysters that are grown in the same waters as wild caught oysters, but they're grown in cages. And it's not like you think with like salmon or farm raised fish or stuff like that. It's very similar to a wild oyster, but the cool thing is you can control the size. They're a lot cleaner. They actually have a crisper and cleaner taste too because they're not on the bottom in the mud. They're raised up on top in cages, or at least off the bottom of cages. So then I started really getting interested in farm raised oysters as well. And talking about farm raised oysters, these oysters that I'm chucking today are actually not farm raised oysters. These are wild caught oysters from Canada. And what I noticed about them is they were really inconsistent, including some were completely dead when I got them. You can tell by that hollow sound right there that this is a dead oyster compared to this live oyster right here. When you see that the shell is broken like this, you know that's an oyster you do not want to eat and you want to toss it out. Now, smell can be another indication of bad oysters, but that's not always the case. This one though, you could tell it was bad due to its smell. Once I popped this oyster open, there was the most horrific rotten egg or sulfur smell that I've ever smelled come from an oyster. And the color of the oyster was gray. At first, I decided I was just going to close it up and throw it away, but I wanted to show you this is what an oyster you do not want to eat is going to look like. It's kind of that gray color and it reeked. I had to take the board, the knife, and everything, including myself, and go sanitize it before I shucked the next oyster. Now, back to my oyster origin story. I started eating them, like I said, in college. Started off with wild caught and then went to farm raised. And honestly, it wasn't until I was older and was a teacher in St. Mary's County Public Schools that I started eating at a place called the Ruddy Duck. And it just so happened that they had a brunch that was an all you can eat oyster bar. So that oyster bar only had farm raised oysters, and one day it was slow in there, and I decided I was going to try my hand at eating as many oysters as I possibly could. I started out with probably just like 10 or so, and then 10 led to 15, and then 15 led to 20, and we just kind of hung out there because it was a gloomy, gross day and we had nowhere else to go. And throughout the course of the day, I ended up eating just about 48 oysters. Now, crazy enough, they actually crowned me the Oyster King, but I did hear a few years down the road, someone came in and took that crown from me, and that's all right. Now, a little side note here, if you don't know much about oysters, this is an oyster right here. Right here where I'm pointing my knife is actually the adductor muscle. That's what opens and closes the oyster. The back is where the stomach is, and those are the gills at the front there. So you're eating the whole oyster when you eat it, and I think one of the sweetest parts of the oyster is actually that little adductor muscle there. Now, back to the real story here. Can I eat more than 48 oysters like I did at the Ruddy Duck Seafood and Ale House? And here's the first one down the hatch. Now, when I was planning out this video, I didn't really think this through. I realized that I was going to have to eat these fairly quickly because when I was at the all you can eat brunch, I actually ate them probably over about 2 hours and I never felt like full. It just would go up every little while, every 15-20 minutes, and eat another 10 oysters. This one, I had to do it in pretty quick succession because I didn't want to sit here all day staring at this tray of oysters that I just shucked. So I got to work and started eating them pretty quickly. Honestly, the first few weren't bad at all. I was through 4 here and I was thinking, I got this in the bag. I also decided pretty early on I was going to put any condiments on any of the oysters just because I thought it would be a little easier on my stomach not to have a whole bunch of hot sauce or cocktail sauce or even lemon juice in there. So my plan was just to eat these without anything on them. And honestly, they were tasting really good. Malpac oysters are known for being a little bit salty, have some sweetness and stuff like that. I was pretty surprised how good these were for how hard they were to shuck and the appearance of some of the oysters in the box. At this point, I was 8 oysters through, and I thought I was going to be perfectly fine. Oysters are pretty small, so they don't really fill up your stomach too much, but I was a little bit concerned about all that stuff kind of sloshing around down there. But after I got the hang of it and really just started putting it back, I felt pretty confident I was going to be able to get to my record. And as I approached 10, I realized that might be a little bit harder than I thought. At this point, the oysters were sitting pretty heavy in my stomach and kind of sloshing around, so I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to get through all of them. So what I decided to do was get to about a dozen and then get up and walk around a little bit, and hopefully it would make me feel a little bit better.
I'm not enjoying this. never again.